Mr. Leiter, I want to start with you because you know, head of the NCTC, you are really the expert at connecting the dots, and you performed a masterful job while you were there. You and I have worked with Joint Terrorism Task Forces. They have an enormous challenge, an enormous amount of data that comes through, and many of which, if you miss one thread of evidence, you can be held accountable by members of Congress like myself at a later hearing. But these emails, the 18 emails that took place, when we were briefed by senior intelligence officials, and they wouldn't give us the content, they would just simply say, the only word I can use is downplay the significance of these emails. Finally, when the good work of the Webster Report revealed these emails publicly, we all had a chance to actually read the content. And the one that I described in my opening statement on May the 31st of 2009, Major Hassan, he almost seems to be telegraphing exactly what he's getting ready to do. Almost asking for permission from al-Awlaki in Yemen. Is it okay for a suicide bomber to kill soldiers and innocent civilians in the cause to protect our fellow brothers? You know, you and I have worked in law enforcement. This is one of 18. The other one, you know, here's keep me on your Rolodex, you know. To me, this is a huge flag. It was a big deal in San Diego. The San Diego Joint Terrorism Task Force thought, wow, there's something wrong going on here. We need to start, let's send a lead to WFO. Let's have them investigate. The response from WFO is astounding, that, well, we don't really see a terrorist threat here. And they basically shut down this investigation until 5 months later when Major Hassan kills 13 people, 12 soldiers. There is a Department of Defense official on the Joint Terrorism Task Force, and yet that official didn't contact Fort Hood. Maybe it's the legal restrictions that you're talking about. If so, we need to change that. There were so many flags, not only between the FBI two offices, and I really commend the San Diego office for their courage and bravery of trying to get to the bottom of this. I fault the WFO office for not following up on this. And in the military, the way they pass this guy along, knowing he's proselytizing radical Islam. You know, with business cards, soldier of Allah, he's enraging his colleagues, and what do? They just sort of, they don't want to deal with the problem. They went pass him along, promote him, send him down to Fort Hood. So, so many flags in this case. How could the dots were identified, but they weren't shared? How did this happen?
Well, Congressman, I will say that I agree with you that it did not take long from my perspective to know that this is an act of terrorism. In fact, National Counterterrorism Center, within a week of the event, entered this into its worldwide database of terrorist events based on preliminary reports. And that was not a conclusive legal judgment, but certainly all the indications were that this was terrorism. I think in terms of the information that was not shared, you had a breakdown along so many different angles. Yeah. San Diego team, I think, did do a very good job, and I would defer to Mr. Winter, of course, who knows these details better than I, but they were not even aware of all of the emails. They were not aware of the Department of Defense information. WFO was not aware of much of that, and it was handed to an officer who, frankly, from an outsider's perspective, I think didn't have a really strong understanding of the signs of radicalization. Now, the 2 points I would make quickly in defense of how this evolved is, one, we do have to put ourselves back in 2009 to recall who Anwar al-Awlaki was then versus who he is perceived to be today. And in 2011, 2012, we understood him to be an operational leader in a way that in 2009 we did not. Now, that is not an excuse, but it is some color. The second piece is, from my perspective, Congressman, the idea that people would not go talk to him, I do not understand. And I do believe that if that information were shared with a broader group who understood radicalization, there would have been increased pressure from headquarters to make that happen. And that would have led to, I believe, a better outcome.
I can agree with you more. I talked to the commanding officer at Fort Hood, and wouldn't you have liked to have known this? Yeah. I know, I understand fights are complicated. I understand, you don't want to shake down somebody and you want to, they could have at least watched him, put him under some sort of surveillance. And just maybe that would have stopped, what happened. My time is limited. I do want to go to Mr. Winter. 18 emails, WFO only has 2 emails. Some technology breakdown occurs where they're not even aware. They can't even access, they don't even know how to access to get these remaining emails. And I have to say, Mr. Leiter, I mean, you as a former Justice Department official like myself, this May 23rd or May 31st email, if you read this, would that concern you?
Congressman, I look at one email and I look at the body of the emails, and to me, they are clear indicators of an individual who has been radicalized. Whether or not he has been mobilized to take action, that's a hard call.
But when he's asking permission to perform a suicide bombing mission against soldiers and civilians at a dinner to protect his fellow brothers.
As I said, that's why, Congressman,
yeah,
I would want somebody to go out and interview this guy who's clearly been radicalized.
And I think that's what should have happened in this case. Mr. Winter, what happened here?
The decisions made in Denver were based on a cascading set of circumstances.
Your microphone? Yeah, sorry.
I'm sorry? Is that better?
Yeah, it is.
The decisions made at WFO were the result of truly a cascading set of circumstances. San Diego set this lead based on the first 2 emails that were acquired from Hassan to Awlaki. There was no FBI policy on the assignment of these types of leads or on taking action on these types of leads. The supervisor in WFO waited 50 days after the arrival of the lead to read it and to assign it. He assigned it to a DCIS agent who was a task force officer. That agent waited 90 days from then to read it and to act on it. Under informal FBI practice, agents had 90 days to work on leads, either to elevate them into an investigation or to close them down. So this agent read that lead and acted on it on the last day under that FBI practice, and indeed conducted this assessment in 4 hours on that day. So it was rushed. There was that pressure that was created by their workload and these late assignments. He consulted U.S. Army electronic personnel files on Major Hassan. That was the entirety of what he, as a DCIS agent, could have access to from the JTTF. That meant he received a brief and highly misleading set of personnel records that indicated that Major Hassan had a security clearance. He had been promoted to major only 10 days earlier, and his supervisors praised him thoroughly. The only negative in those 80-some pages, I believe, was that he had failed his PT test.
They praised him, I think,
they praised his research on Islam in the military. Now, Hassan had used his real name in communicating with Awlaki, so had not tried to render himself anonymous. The DCIS agent concluded, based on that this was part of Hassan's research on Islam in the military and that the Army approved of it. At the same time, there was no FBI policy on what's called a baseline collection plan. That policy was instituted in September 2009 after this investigation, but before the Fort Hood shootings. That created a minimum of what agents are meant to collect when conducting an assessment. If that plan had been in effect then, this agent would have been required to consult the DWS EDMS system, which is the computer database on which all of the messages from Hassan to Awlaki and vice versa were stored. Thus, he would have known of that, and he would have been required to search it. But he'd not been trained on that database. He didn't even know it existed. So what he believed after searching FBI databases was that there were only 2 emails, that they were sent in December 2008 and January 2009, which was 5 months prior, and that Awlaki had not responded. Based on that, he concluded, and his supervisor concluded, that Hassan was not involved in, quote, terrorist activities. Now, did that resolve the question of whether or not Hassan was a threat? We didn't believe so. We felt that this decision-making process was flawed, and that they should have considered and conducted an interview of Hassan based solely on the information they had at that time. But I'm not defending the decision. I'm explaining it. You can understand how reasonably these men could have been led down this path by the combination of all these circumstances, some of which were self-imposed, others which were the result of a lack of policy, others are a result of an inability to gain access to those records that Walter Reed, for example, had.
I think those problems need to be fixed. But I will ask you this question. Do you believe, I believe that gross errors were made in this matter that resulted in 13 people being killed, 12 soldiers. Should anybody be held accountable within the Federal Government?
On our review, we were specifically asked by Director Miller to assess whether any disciplinary action should be taken against any of the personnel involved. Although we found that mistakes were made, we found that these individuals acted with good intent, they acted mostly reasonably under the circumstances, and that they were not individually responsible for some of the decisions that occurred because of the lack of policy direction, for example. One of the reasons we advocated the 7 policies that we recommended was that if those policies had been in place, and similar procedures, then actions like this would violate them and individuals would be directly responsible and subject to discipline.
Is it your understanding these policies are in place now?
Almost all of the policies are in place. They're not, some of them are being coordinated into a single policy, the command and control hierarchy, for example.
Yeah, my time's kind of running short, but on the Senate report, they indicate the San Diego office calls WFO, and the response back is, look, we don't want to damage his stellar career, and something to the effect of this is a politically sensitive matter. That was not corroborated by the WFO office. Is that correct?
That's correct.
But according to San Diego, that conversation
took
place.
Well, the first part that you discussed is corroborated, that WFO advised San Diego twice that they did not believe an interview of Hassan was appropriate because it would damage him in terms of his position in the military. The chain of command would not take it lightly. I
do think that the American people and the families and the victims deserve that somebody in this government be held accountable for what happened. Professor, I want to ask you real briefly with my limited time left. You spoke very eloquently of your experience of a fear of speaking out. Within the Department of Defense, you know, we have this individual that various of his colleagues are seeing these warning signs popping up. They call him a ticking time bomb. He's proselytizing radical Islam, talking about Osama bin Laden, having business cards that say soldier of Allah. I mean, so many indicators are there, and that no one wants to speak out. There's a fear of retribution within the Army, and he's just sort of passed along. Is this a case where political correctness was more important or overshadowed national security?
It sure sounds like that. If you can hear me, it sure sounds like that. Thank you. It sure sounds like that, Congressman. And frankly, I think it would be fair to ask if political correctness also crept into the FBI. For example, we've spent the last several minutes talking about how somebody at the San Diego office of the FBI had a troubling lead, passed it on to the Washington field office, after which it went nowhere. And one of the questions I have as I'm listening to these other testimonies is, why did the San Diego officer not stand up when it became clear to him or her that, an obviously unsettling lead was not going to be acted upon? Yep. Now, one can argue that, well, it's obvious why people don't stand up in general, because doing so invites complication in your life. And life is complicated enough, thank you very much. But this is where I believe we can actually learn something about a mechanism that the Department of State has put into place. And that is a mechanism called the dissent channel. And it was actually introduced just after the Vietnam War. whereby foreign policy officers, when they see that the chain of command is going to be resisting their dissent with groupthink, with the subtle consensus that has been accepted for too long within the cozy confines of that department, they can actually use this dissent channel to explain why somebody higher up needs to hear a counter-argument, and they do not have to get permission from their higher-ups in order to be heard through this channel. I don't think that that exists either at the Department of Defense or at the FBI, but it's something well worth investigating. Whether it works, as it did, by the way, in the lead-up to the Balkan genocide, and it was, one could argue that that was the reason, because at the time, Secretary of State Eagleburger heard a dissenting voice through that channel and realized that the United States must intervene. It was through that I think we can learn a little bit more about how dissent can be institutionalized so that it is constructive rather than chaotic.
Thank you. That's an excellent point. Chair now recognizes the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and